Hi everyone. I hope everyone had a good day. I'm Jiawei Teo, who is one of the trial coordinator for the Bridge trial study. First, I'd like to thank you for everyone's time and welcome to today's Bridge trial webinar. As you know, this trial could not have been a success without your continuous support and participation. Please give yourself a pat on your back. Thank you so much. As you know, we are 6 months into the study, and we thought it would be great to get together and give our participants an update on the trial and have the opportunity to have a feedback and discussion session. I will now hand over the talk to Michaela to introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much. So I think I met most of you. I'm Michaela. I'm one of the immunologists at Charlie's, and I'm the principal investigator for the Charlie's side. So I really thank you all for your participation. And I personally was very excited to be part of this trial because the BCG vaccine is a very interesting vaccine, and it may well be our solution to COVID. So it's my great pleasure that Professor Nigel Curtis from the MCRI, who is the overall principal investigator of this, which is now a very large study, is able to talk to you today. And he certainly had some, which I hear, very successful webinars at Fiona Stanley and the Perth Children's Hospital already. It's my great pleasure to introduce Nigel to you, who's going to talk to you about BCG, the BRACE trial, and where this may all take us. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all. So, yes, great to have this opportunity to talk to you about the BRACE trial. As you've heard, my name is Nigel Curtis. I'm a clinician and researcher at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and the University of Melbourne, and I'm the chief principal investigator of the BRACE trial. And as well as thanking you as participants, I would like to thank Michaela, who did a wonderful job at getting a large number of people recruited from Sir Charles Gardner Hospital very quickly. And that was really instrumental in helping this trial become very successful and eventually to expand internationally, as you'll hear. Now, I'm speaking to you today from Melbourne, where we're still in a level 4 lockdown and only recently been released from only being allowed out of our house for 1 or 2 hours a day. We have to wear a mask everywhere, and we're not really allowed to see our friends at all, or just about, and in very small numbers and outdoors, although things are getting much better, I have to say, in Victoria. But we're really envious when we look at you in Western Australia, watching the footy and crowds and basically life carrying on pretty much as per normal, which I know is an issue for the BRACE trial, and I'm going to be addressing that directly at the end. So wait for this, watch this space for that part of the talk. I'm going to go back a bit and just talk about the history of pandemics, because it's interesting to put COVID-19 here at the bottom on this timeline of pandemics in perspective. And as you know, there's over 1.1 million deaths from COVID-19, now surpassing Asian flu and Hong Kong flu back in the 50s and 60s. But interestingly, nowhere near yet the mortality of Spanish flu after the First World War, or smallpox historically, or back here in the 14th century, Black Death or bubonic plague. And the COVID-19 pandemic was amazingly predicted in this TED talk by Bill Gates. And if you haven't watched this, this is well worth 8 minutes and 36 seconds of your time. Highly recommend you look at this prescient talk where he really describes what will happen if we don't do all the things that it turns out we didn't do to protect ourselves against what he thought would be a novel influenza virus, but of course has turned out to be a coronavirus. Well worth watching. And it's the accuracy of his prediction of the consequences of a pandemic that has led to the conspiracy theories that Bill Gates was behind COVID-19, which of course he wasn't. Now, this is just as of today. There are now over 40 million cases globally, or at least those that have been recorded, as well as those deaths. The red blobs are the cumulative cases, and here in yellow or orangey color, the active cases. And you can see down here in Australia, we've got very small dots, which again we'll come to. And the concerning thing to me is that if you look at the 40 million confirmed cases worldwide and the curve distributed by different continents, if you look at the trajectory of this total, it is not decreasing in its upward slope. So we are a long way from coming to terms with this pandemic on a worldwide basis. Obviously, there may be vaccines soon, but it may be a little while. And of course, it's healthcare workers that are particularly at risk. And this has been well documented in the media, both in Europe, the US, and in Australia, that healthcare workers are, of course, more highly vulnerable. Now, it is a coronavirus specific vaccine that we need. And of course, you know, there are many being tested worldwide, and Australia has at least reserved a large number of doses of the Chadox vaccine from Oxford. And of course, we all hope that'll work, but it depends on trials succeeding. And it will be, most recently, Andy Pollard from the Oxford Vaccine Group, a colleague of mine, on a webinar last week, said that it will be probably at least mid-year at the earliest before this vaccine will be available, if indeed it is successful. And to be a successful vaccine, of course, this needs to work in various different groups, it has to have high effectiveness, and of course, we would love it if it could reduce transmission as well. And that is, of course, the ultimate goal. And the BCG vaccine is just a stopgap that we would use until this becomes available, and also something we could use in future pandemics. And who knows what's coming along in, you know, will there be a COVID-23, for example? So, and as you know, the BRACE trial is testing whether COVID-19 in a randomized controlled trial, randomizing healthcare workers to BCG vaccine or no BCG, following them from a year to see if we can reduce the severity of COVID-19 in those who become infected. Now, the rest of this talk comes from Wikipedia. And if you go to Wikipedia to look at BCG, you'll see that the vaccine was invented by myself, Professor Nigel Curtis, when he was a medical student. Now, this joke has become quite old. I've used this for a while, and this has been corrected, of course, on Wikipedia, and you can use it to teach your children not to use Wikipedia for their homework. But it has gained traction. And despite the fact that it's Kalmat and Göran who really created this vaccine, it's still in social media me. And if you look at tuberculosis BCG vaccine, if you follow that on Instagram, you'll see recently that so pleased that Professor Nigel Curtis invented BCG vaccine, hashtag vaccine, hashtag genius. And this has gained great traction on social media, despite the fact that it is fake news. And if you look on Twitter, you'll see that Donald Trump just recently tweeted that Professor Nigel Curtis invented BCG vaccine to prevent severe COVID-19. I wish I'd been in his trial. And that's a tag there you can see. So BCG vaccine created about 100 years ago by Albert Calmette and Camille Guérin, probably one of the world's most effective and successful vaccines. And what we thought about it was that it, by altering adaptive immunity and probably cell-mediated immunity, it was created, of course, to protect against tuberculosis. But what we now understand is that this vaccine also has activity against, it also affects the innate immune system, which is the frontline, first part of the immune system, which is called into action in the first few hours and days of exposure to any virus, bacteria, protozoa, any infection. And that's the first part of your immune system that protects you until days and weeks which it takes for antibodies and cell-mediated immunity to kick in. And it's this part of the immune system that BCG is now understood to have activity on. So now when we think of BCG and the immune response that it leads to, we think of a specific immune response that protects against the target disease, of course, tuberculosis, and what we call a non-specific immune response that has off-target effects, the target being TB, so off-target. And these are what I call the accidental advantages or heterologous immune effects of BCG that are now thought to have multiple effects on other infections and also allergies, which we've done a lot of work on in our group. And of course, the overall effect of the vaccine is the combination of those two effects. Now, the question is, why might BCG reduce the impact of COVID-19? And this is, of course, the basis of the BRACE trial. And I thought I'd briefly tell you the evidence upon which we're using to justify doing a trial. Now, the first I've told you about, which is that BCG induces trained immunity. And trained immunity is the term used for the effect of BCG on innate immune cells. So these are NK cells and monocytes and neutrophils. And what we now understand is that these cells do actually have some memory. This was always thought that these cells were just weren't really affected and stayed the same. But now we know that with something like BCG, there are metabolic and subsequent epigenetic changes in these innate immune cells. That means that when they have a second hit with something like SARS-CoV-2, the immune response is more rapid and stronger. So that's the first and probably the most important property of BCG upon which our trial is based. Now, for many decades, it's been known that BCG can protect animals in animal models against a variety of different infections. And these have been reviewed in these papers here that you could look at later that document studies from back in the 50s. And the one that's very relevant to COVID-19 are these studies in mice, which were specifically showing that if you immunized mice with BCG, you could protect them against a virus called Mengo virus. And that's of great relevance because this is a single-stranded positive sense RNA virus, which is similar to which is the same type of virus as the SARS-CoV-2. So kind of relevant, but done very many years ago. But perhaps my most favorite of many, many experiments that I'll show you, if I have to pick one, it's this one. And this one is a study in mice where they took mouse malaria parasites. So if you take the plasmodium that causes malaria in mice and inoculate mice with those parasites, you can wait a week or so and the parasites multiply in the blood until there's 100% or almost 100% parasitemia. And if you're a mouse, that is bad news because that will kill you. Now, if you take the same mice, but obviously not the identical same mice because those mice are now dead, but if you take the same relatives of those mice, the same strain, and now immunize them with BCG, that induces a stronger immune response so that they can now control that parasitemia and those mice survive. And this is a beautiful illustration of how you could, in many different experiments of this nature, where you can use BCG to improve the immune response and protect against infection and death from a variety of different pathogens. Now in humans, there's very good evidence in high mortality countries, and specifically Guinea-Bissau and West Africa, where Peter Arby and his group have done a number of randomized controlled trials in neonates, where they've randomized low birth weight neonates to either BCG or no BCG and followed them, and shown that over the first 6 months or even 12 months of life, there's reduced mortality in those infants that were immunized with BCG. In this case, BCG, one strain called BCG Denmark. And this improved survival in those who are vaccinated with BCG is too large that gap is too big to be explained just by protection against tuberculosis. And that reduced mortality is due to improved survival from the things that would kill you in a West African country in the first 6 months of life. And those are respiratory infections and sepsis. So this increased survival from BCG is thought to be due to improving the immune response of neonates. What about in low mortality countries? Well, there's no randomized, or there are very few randomized controlled trials, but there are some very large observational studies. These two, and more than one on the left, in 40,000 children, the one on the right in over 400,000 hospitalizations, that have looked at hospitalizations for respiratory infections, and on the one on the right from sepsis, showing around a 40% decrease. And this dramatic effect, though, I have to emphasize, is from retrospective studies with all of the potential limitations of those kind of studies, but nonetheless interesting. But in terms of a randomized controlled trial, this from a couple of years ago created quite a lot of interest, because in this study, which was comparing a new TB vaccine, that's the H4IC31, there were two control groups of interest in this group of adolescents in South Africa. And those two groups in the controls either had nothing, or a placebo, or BCG. So you could compare BCG with placebo. And they found that in the BCG group, compared with those who didn't have BCG, there was a more than 70% reduction in upper respiratory tract infections. Again, this was not the main point of this study. This was a secondary finding on a sub-analysis, but nonetheless from a randomized controlled trial in adolescents. And finally, this evidence from a human challenge model from our colleagues in the Netherlands, where they asked medical students, or rather they bribed medical students with a pizza to be randomized to BCG or no BCG. And 1 month later, they immunized them with the yellow fever vaccine. Now, following this vaccine, there is a detectable viremia in the blood, and they showed that in those who'd had BCG, there was a reduction in the viremia. Again, what we're hoping to do in BRACE is that following exposure to the virus, we're hoping that BCG, with an improved immune response, as was shown in this human challenge model, there'll be a reduced viremia from the virus and therefore less severe disease. So on the basis of this, my group had been working on BCG trials for the last decade, but mainly in neonates and in infants. But we wondered about using BCG for COVID-19, and we got together on the 8th of March, and we started to put together all of the things you need for a randomized controlled trial. So we designed a protocol and wrote all the necessary procedures and started all the horrible administrative work for ethical and governance approvals and arranging the BCG and laboratory supplies. We had an app, the app that you're using developed very rapidly, and hence there were a number of problems with that app when it started, as I'm sure many of you are aware of. And we moved through all of the different things that are required for a trial. And at this point, we had very little funding. And it was really two things that enabled us to get off the ground. One was some local funding and funding from the Minderoo Foundation in Western Australia. But what really made a difference was the support of Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, who gave his wholehearted support to trials of BCG being started in healthcare workers. And it was really that really enabled us to secure funding. So we spent 3 weeks, 3 very busy weeks, day and night, getting everything ready. And in record time, we started recruitment at the very end of March, both in Victoria and very shortly after that in Western Australia. And this was all done very quickly and all arranged by Zoom by an extremely dedicated group of people, including, you can see here, Superman, better known as Peter Richmond, but he's certainly wearing what looks like a Superman costume to me. You might also recognize Toby Coleman, also from Perth, and the rest of our team, too many to name. So the BRACE trial, as you know, randomized to BCG vaccine or not, and we're following participants for 12 months. And it's a very big ask of our participants, and we certainly appreciate that this is quite what we call a high burden study for participants, because of course, as you know, we're asking that with every episode where you have symptoms that are compatible with COVID-19, which unfortunately we now know is almost any symptom, but certainly respiratory symptoms and fever, etc., and loss of sense of taste and smell. With any symptoms, we ask you to not only record your symptoms in the app tracker, but also to have a test for COVID-19 so that we can tell whether that episode of illness is, of course, due to SARS-CoV-2. And we understand that this has been a really big problem in Western Australia because it sometimes has not been possible for participants to obtain that testing. And I will come back to that. So we originally started, and the idea was 4,000 healthcare workers in Australia. And when we started at the end of March, it's hard to believe now, but I'll just remind you that it was predicted that Australia would have a major epidemic of COVID-19 and that we would run out of ventilators. It was, the peak would be around May, mid-May, and that is why we started so quickly, because we wanted to be ahead of that. But of course, we now know that we managed to control COVID-19 absolutely superbly in Australia, and that's wonderful, but not so good, of course, for trials. So we started with some initial funding, as I've mentioned, from locally and from the Minderoo Foundation. And with that funding, we started in those 2 states. But our trial then gained some increased traction when Bill Gates heard about it, and he suggested that we put in an application for further funding so that we could expand our trial outside of Australia. And with a very large donation, that enabled us to leverage further funding from other sources. And we're very grateful, of course, to all of these funding sources. And with that funding, we were able to expand our study to include both New South Wales and South Australia, and to expand to 10,000 healthcare workers. And also we realized we would need to go to countries where there was more COVID-19. And so we also started arrangements to recruit in the Netherlands, in Spain, and in the UK. Now, no sooner than we started those arrangements, but it looked as if COVID-19 might disappear in Europe. And so we very rapidly realized we needed also to start in countries where the curve was still rising, and that's South America. And so we now have 2 sites in Brazil, where, as I'm sure you know, is one of the countries with the highest rates of COVID-19. So we're now a 5-country trial. I'm pleased to say that we started recruiting in Brazil just yesterday. You can imagine how much work it takes to get a trial started in a country that far away with very different regulatory requirements. But we now have 5 countries that are actively recruiting for the BRACE trial, and it's all one big trial, and everyone is part of this 10,000 healthcare worker trial. Now, when we started our collaboration with Brazil. This is what I had in mind. But unfortunately, collaboration in Brazil these days looks, unfortunately, very much like this. It's just another Zoom meeting with our main collaborators on the left, the Melbourne crew on the right, and the only thing that gives you any clue that this is Brazil is Julio's traditional Brazilian headdress here, and that's all the only thing we have. Other than that, it's just simply more Zoom meetings at even more unsociable hours. And of course, you'll understand why we went to Brazil. These are currently on a linear scale. You'll see many of these graphs that you see are on exponential scale, so you have to be careful. But this is a linear scale, and this is the number of new cases. And you can see Brazil still very high despite coming down a bit. UK completely out of control in its second wave. Similarly, Spain, very bad second wave, and the Netherlands. But down here in Australia, we're very lucky still on a worldwide comparison, very low rates. So very important for us to have those other countries involved. Now, we're not the only people to have thought of doing a study of BCG to reduce the impact of COVID-19. In fact, there are 12 studies in multiple different countries. But what you'll see, so ranging, you can see the different countries here from Egypt and the Netherlands and South Africa and France and the US. And you can see that these studies are all smaller than the BRACE study. And most of them are 1,000 or 2,000. Most of them are in healthcare workers, but some of them are in the elderly, and particularly this large one here. This large one here is not in the in healthcare workers. And you can see they've got various different names like Battle and BCG Corona. And we thought our name was pretty cool until we realized that actually the even better name is the one in the state called the Badass study. And that's the only one that's actually using a different strain of BCG, which we can talk about later if you wish. Now, our study is by far the largest, and it's the only one that is included in the New York Times Corona Vaccine Tracker. We're one of these 6 phase 3 vaccines here that is mentioned. And the reason why we're included in this and why Gates were prepared to fund us are for 2 reasons that make our trial distinct, and I would say better than other trials. The first is our outcome of severe COVID-19. Now, you will know that when you come into contact with SARS-CoV-2, a large proportion, and we're now realizing a larger proportion than we had initially thought, are asymptomatic COVID-19, so obviously remain very well. A proportion go on to have mild symptoms, a bit like a cold, and that some go on to have more severe symptoms, which may or may not require hospitalization, oxygen, ventilation, etc. And of course, some people unfortunately die. Now, in our trial, one of our primary outcomes is severe COVID-19, which includes not just hospitalized COVID-19 deaths, but also those who are unwell enough to be unwell for 3 days, or what we call 3 days incapacitated, as defined by being too unwell to work for 3 days or being essentially confined to bed, either of those two. And we're the only trial that is able to look at severe COVID-19 because you do need at least 10,000 healthcare workers to have any chance of being able to detect a difference in severe disease. And that's why this particular outcome of unwell for 3 days is of great interest to us, and we'll come back to that and why it's very important that every episode like that is recorded. Now, of course, we are also including symptomatic COVID-19 of any symptoms, and that's the outcome of which most of the other trials are looking at alone. Now, the reason why this is important is because, of course, what we're hoping is that those who have BCG will have both reduced severe COVID-19 and reduced symptomatic COVID-19. But there is another possibility, and that is that we might reduce severe COVID-19, but actually increase symptomatic COVID-19. And the reason why this is possible is if you, as I've explained with BCG, if we're inducing an improved and stronger immune response, that might prevent progression to severe COVID-19, which is what we're hoping, but it might also mean that people have more symptoms. You might get more fever because of a more robust immune response. Now, if BCG does this, we'd be very happy because, of course, it's really only severe COVID-19 that's a problem. If you're unwell for a day or two with a fever, that's not such a big concern on a kind of a global level and for a pandemic. So in the BCG study, of course, we are collecting all this data not just by the symptom diaries, but also surveys at 3, 6, and 9, 12 months, because it's critical in a trial that we do not have missing data, which I'm going to come on to. And as you know, we arranged to have blood at baseline so that we could tell in subsequent analysis if anyone had been exposed prior to taking part in the study. We took blood 3 months after starting so that we have some blood that we'll be able to use to understand how BCG has affected the immune response, and blood at the end of the study at 12 months. And that particular time point was designed for us to look at antibodies again so that we could see during the study if anybody had asymptomatic COVID-19 by looking for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in that blood at 12 months and comparing it with the baseline blood. That was our original design. Now, unfortunately, shortly after starting our study, a number of papers came out, and this headline you can see in the newspaper, immunity could be lost within months. And this was referring to the fact that studies started to come out that showed that those who had COVID-19 did develop antibodies, but those antibodies started to wane. They started to reduce, started to decrease over a very short time period. And in some cases disappeared within 3 or 4 months. And so we soon realized that by just checking at 12 months, we could easily miss an episode of COVID-19 or episode of antibody conversion. And so we were asked, so we had discussion about this, and in discussion with the Gates Foundation, we decided that we really needed to add in blood samples at 6 and 9 months. Now, I can tell you that this is not something that I wanted to do or any of us wanted to do, because this is a major undertaking to add additional blood samples to a trial. First of all, it's very inconvenient for our participants. We know that that's an extra thing we're asking you to do. It's a terrible thing to ask our investigators at each of the centers to arrange. There's a lot of arrangements to be made. And it's very bad news for me as the kind of person trying to manage a budget, because whatever it costs, when you multiply it by 10,000, it's a lot of money. So, you can see that this is not something we wanted to do, but scientifically it's something we have to do, because if somebody becomes unwell, for example, for 2 reasons. The first reason is we do need to know whether anyone has had asymptomatic COVID-19. And as I've explained, it's only by doing blood tests every 3 months that we'll catch somebody who develops antibodies but then loses them before the 12-month time point. But the second reason that we need to do this is because if somebody has been unable to get COVID testing with an episode of illness, if we have antibody testing and we can show that they do not have antibodies at this point, we can be fairly certain, 99% certain at least, that any episode they had in the previous 3 months was not COVID-19. And this ability to say that people have not had COVID-19 is as important as being able to say they have had it. And that might sound counterintuitive, but this is critical for the study, because any participant who is unwell, and then we can't tell whether they're unable to get testing, and we do not have their serum sample, is unfortunately going to have to be taken out of that analysis. And that means that we can't say they're negative. And missing data is something that will kill the BRACE trial. Now, you might think that, hang on a minute, there's no COVID-19 in Western Australia, or South Australia for that matter. And therefore, if I'm sick in August, it couldn't have been COVID-19. And I actually accept that point. It's a reasonable thing to assume. But we have run this past the Gates Foundation. We've run it past a number of different trialists around the world. And they've all said this will not cut it. You cannot simply do a trial and say, we assumed that this was not COVID-19. They say it will be necessary for us to prove by serology or by testing that each episode of illness was not COVID-19. And so that is why we're really strongly encouraging you, and in fact, even I go as far as say pleading with you to please at least have the blood test done, and ideally also any swab testing, even though I acknowledge that it's highly unlikely that you will have had COVID-19 if you live in a place where there's essentially no COVID-19 at the moment. And I'm happy to come back to that in questions, but this is a problem for us all, and I totally understand that. And of course, this is the elephant in the room. And I've had great fun looking for pictures of elephant in the room. I think this is my favorite one. There are more pictures than you can possibly imagine on Google Images for this. And you can see that the rates here in Australia, the total here in blue is all due to Victoria and a little bit in green, which is New South Wales. And if you look at these epidemic curves expressed as the number of new infections, the black is total, yellow is Victoria, and just basically very, very little from the other states. And you can see orange is Western Australia, but virtually nothing except for this little tiny bump in September. But nonetheless, unfortunately, internationally, it will not be acceptable simply to say there is no way that any episode was not COVID-19, because it requires only very small numbers of misclassified participants in either side of this trial for it to have an impact on the accuracy and veracity of the result. So the elephant in the room does come to what I've been hinting at, is what I promised to talk to you about today. Both Peter Richmond and Michaela asked me to kind of provide a list and to convince you why you should continue providing symptom data and blood samples to BRACE. And the first one is really what I've been talking about, is that we really do need to know about COVID-19. But COVID-19 is the primary outcome, but it's very important that to tell you about our secondary outcomes, which are not related to COVID-19. And this comes back to the fact that BCG is agnostic to pathogen and will protect against, of course, any virus. So we're very interested to know if there's no COVID-19 in the area, for example, Western Australia, then at least we can look to see where there are reduced infections from other pathogens. So we'll be looking at other respiratory pathogens and other bacterial and viral illnesses. And we could do that both by just symptomatic disease. If there's less just flu-like illnesses in one group than the other, that will be of importance. And we can also use the bloods, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So first of all, as I said, there'll be other viruses to which people will be exposed to during that time. And in relation to non-COVID respiratory infections, I'd like to show you the results of this interim analysis, published only a month or two back in Cell from our colleagues again in the Netherlands from the Activate study. Now, this was a study in the elderly, doesn't seem that old to me, over 65, but elderly individuals were randomized to BCG or not to BCG and followed. And you can see from here, from these results, that those who had BCG took longer before they had their next infection, and they had overall reduced number of infections. And overall, there was a 40% drop in any infection and a nearly 80% drop in what were thought to be respiratory viral infections. So this is the really very good evidence from a randomized controlled trial, but in a specific group, as I say, in the elderly, and as an interim analysis only, but nonetheless some reassuring evidence that BCG can prevent all respiratory infections. And that is an important secondary outcome in the BRACE trial. So regardless of whether there's any COVID-19, we can still look at this in our trial. And that's why the participants in Western Australia are still crucial for us. Another viral infection that's easy to measure is the virus, herpes simplex virus, which causes cold sores. And this is a systematic review that was recently published by Laure Pité, who is one of the principal investigators in our trial. She's from Switzerland. She's in charge of the data team here. But she's been interested in this particular topic, and in a systematic review, she showed that in a number of publications, in green, you can see that a high proportion of individuals in trials, not in trials, in studies who've been BCG vaccinated have had either no or less recurrences of cold sores on their lips from the herpes simplex virus. But there's only been one randomized controlled trials, which was flawed and really doesn't tell you much. And so there's never been a randomized controlled trial to look at this particular question. And so, of course, that's something we can easily do. So in the proportion of individuals in the BRACE study who were getting cold sores before, we're really interested to see if there's any change in frequency or severity. And that's why we ask you that in the questionnaire. Now, the second thing we can do is using the blood that we're taking during the trial, we can look to see whether you've been exposed even asymptomatically to different viruses, and whether you've been using a technique called a VIR scan. And in a VIR scan, it's already been used, in fact, in COVID-19 to look at exposure to different coronaviruses. But this, using a very small amount of blood, you can look for seroconversion to a number of different, up to 200 different viruses in one simultaneously. So we're doing this in collaboration with Michael Mina at Harvard in the United States. And this is something we'll do later in those who have given permission for us to use their samples for future studies. So the first thing, why should you continue in the study? Not just COVID-19, but for the non-COVID-19 viral and bacterial infections. Now, the second one is really what I've been alluding to before, that if we have missing data, that will be fatal to the trial. I explained that we really need to know about negative outcome data, just as important, and the serology will enable us to confirm that. If we have many hundreds of individuals with missing data, the whole trial will fall over. It doesn't take too many participants with missing data for the whole thing to fail. And of course, that's a big worry, because this is a very high profile trial internationally. A number of people have got their eyes on this. And those funding bodies that have funded us, if we're not able to come up with the goods, it will, we will have an impact on future funding. The third reason why you should continue is the blood samples that we're taking will enable us to understand how BCG has this ability to induce greater protection against a number of different viruses. We know that we already know that BCG can enhance the response to, for example, flu vaccine. And Peter Richmond is doing a sub-study using participants from Western Australia to look at this specific question, but we can also look at this for other vaccines. And in the BRACE study, we're not just doing serology with all those samples we're taking from you, but we're doing quite sophisticated immunoprofiling with lots of different testing, including, for example, we take blood and we stimulate it with a number of different pathogens in the laboratory and look at the different immune responses, for example, with cytokines, to see if there are differences between those who've had BCG and those who have not. And we've done this before in our neonates and shown that when in those who've had BCG, and this is, as I say, in babies who were immunized at birth, you can see there are differences in cytokine patterns, and that's been published. And this was done in collaboration with both Toby Coleman and Nellie in Western Australia. And fourthly, there are other off-target effects that are not related to infection. And so this is something that is not in the BRACE trial, but is potentially something one could look at later. We'd have to go back and ask participants if they would give us their consent to look at these things. But for example, there's some very nice work by one of our colleagues, Denise Faustman, again in Boston in the United States, who's looked at using repeated doses of BCG in type 1 diabetics. And when she's done that, she's shown that you can see in red a reduction in hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of long-term glucose control in diabetics. And so this is a big trial that's going on in the States. These were preliminary data showing that BCG can somehow alter the trajectory of this autoimmune disease. The other interesting recent publication was this one, which looked at participants who'd been randomized to BCG years before. They were followed up, and this extraordinary finding that decades later, there was a reduced incidence of, let me see if I can remember this, he said with a very poor dad joke, a reduced incidence of Alzheimer's disease in those who had received BCG vaccine. So this is a study that some of the younger people in our group might be able to take on in the future. And number 5 is, look, we don't know what's going to happen in Australia. We've seen in Europe what's been going on has been getting worse. Hopefully Australia really has got COVID-19 under control, but I will remind you that we thought we were safe in Victoria until there was a few overseas travellers came back with coronavirus, and of course the rest is history after poor hotel quarantine. So we certainly don't wish this on any states, despite the fact I'm running this trial. I really don't wish this on anybody in Australia, but we never quite know what's going to happen in the future. And the final reason is probably the one you haven't thought of, and may indeed be the most important reason to stay in the BRACE trial, and why I really would like you to keep providing data on every illness episode that you have, and provide the extra blood samples that we're now asking. And that's that Peter and Michaela said that I would never be able to convince you. And so I'd like you to help me win the bet that I will. And I'm hoping that they're wrong and I'm right. And that when I've explained this to you, that you'll be really keen to keep providing us with everything that is asked, even though we know it is a big ask. And it's very important because the participants are amongst our best. You can see here that after the start with the murky brown participants in Victoria, there was not only a large proportion of our participants come from Western Australia, but they were recruited incredibly quickly, thanks to kind of Lawrence, Peter and Michaela in 3 hospitals in Perth. And you can see that we've then dribbled along in the UK and the Netherlands, and now in Orange in the Netherlands, and we're hoping to increase the rate of recruitment pretty rapidly over the next few weeks in Brazil. And we've got a number of different sites in all those different countries now involved. And there was quite a bit of publicity a couple of days ago worldwide following the start in the UK. They did a great job, and this was taken up by the BBC, and they did, as I said, a lot of media work there. So finally, look, I'm the face of the trial and I'm leading the trial, but of course I represent a very large number of hardworking people who've been really full on since February, many of them working 7 days a week to get the trial started and to keep it on the road. Lots of people in lots of different teams, all working under very difficult circumstances, mainly from home, mainly by Zoom. And I'm sure, and many of them with, in fact, not here, but usually it seems to be compulsory now to either have a pet kind of disturbing you or a child. It's hard to know which is worse during your Zoom call. And of course, I'm also grateful for the large number of people, and not everybody's on this slide yet, it's still a work in progress, but the large number of people who are working in the different sites across Australia and across the world. So I'm going to end there, but very happy to take some questions or discussions with Michaela and Peter, but I will leave it there and move on to some questions and comments. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Nigel. That was really, that was great. And maybe I can't see any sort of questions at the moment at the chat box. I might just hand over to Jaiwei to tell me how you wanted to run the questions. Otherwise, I've got a question that I could start with.
I think you can start actually, and then if anybody comes up with anything, we can go from there. I will ask, if I can, I will just ask anybody of the participants who are there, maybe I'm really keen to know, as a researcher and a trialist, I'd like to know whether or not this intervention, this webinar has been effective. And so I would like you to, in your mind, think, say a score out of 10, how convinced you were at the beginning of the study that it was still important to provide me with data and blood samples. And by the end of this intervention, how convinced you were. So if you started off with a, you know, whatever, a 5 and you're now a 7, just if you could pop that in there, just as 2 numbers in the Q&A. And obviously if you were a 9 and now you're a 3, you should also put that. But that would be something you can be doing whilst we're chatting. But Michaela, I'll hand over to you.
So my question is really, Nigel, how long do you think does the trained immunity effect last? 12 months, or are we going to see, you know, are we still going to be doing brace at 24 months because there will be an effect?
Yes, it's a good question. And this, unfortunately, the simple answer is we can't be sure how long the effect of BCG on inducing trained immunity lasts. We think it's going to last a year or 2, if I had to kind of put a number on it. We certainly know from looking at changes in the immune response that have been documented in challenge studies that you can detect changes out for at least a year. But of course, that's not the same as saying it'll be clinically protective. But we think it's, I suppose, looking at the other way around, we think it's highly unlikely that it's going to be decades. So I think the effect of other intervening infections and certainly other intervening vaccines might have other effects on the immune system that might mitigate the effects of the BCG. And that's why I'm not convinced by any of the studies that have looked back and said, well, let's take, for example, there was a study from Israel in JAMA a few months ago where they took a group of individuals who'd previously received BCG and a group who had not. They tried to match them for everything else, but of course they're probably not matched, but let's say they were matched. And they showed there was no difference in the rates of COVID-19 in those 2 groups. And of course, that does not surprise me because I wouldn't expect the effect of BCG to be still apparent 30 years later. So, you know, that I don't think those kind of studies are very helpful. And that's why we need a randomized control trial to see the effect over the next year or 2. So I guess the other question then is what happens when there is COVID-23? Will we need to come back to participate in Brace, Son of Brace? And the answer will be, we'll very much be coming back to you.
Yeah, that's one of the questions of the panelists as well. Is the trial likely to continue longer than the original 12 months?
That's a good question. So we would like to get this trial finished as quickly as possible for lots of reasons, not the least of which is I'd like to get my life back. But also our budget will not go beyond that kind of time. Clearly, like all vaccine trials, we need to go long enough that we have enough people who develop COVID-19 to compare between the 2 groups. And this is a problem now across all the vaccine trials. So the coronavirus trials are having similar problems to us. So in conversation with my colleagues who are doing those trials, they are also desperately trying to move to countries where there's high rates. They're also realizing it's going to take longer than anticipated. So we naively, when we started, and I totally acknowledge we have completely moved the goalposts, and particularly for the Western Australians who started early, we initially said, rapidly get going, we'll be done in 6 months. And that's what we envisaged when there was this anticipated wave coming that was going to engulf us in COVID-19. And of course, we would have been finished in 6 months. But sadly, that's not the case. And so we have reluctantly had to now say, we'll wait to 12 months to kind of gather as many cases as we can. So the trial will end 12 months after the last participant. But for each participant, it will end 12 months after they were randomized. So we won't be asking you to continue for 12 months after the last Brazilian recruit. Each person will be in for 12 months, but we will have to wait for 12 months for the last one. But a ray of sunshine is that we will also be looking at 6 months, because actually we still had anticipated the primary outcome would initially be looked at 6 months. So 6 months after the last recruit, we will be able to start reporting some results. I think if you'll see that all the coronavirus vaccine trials that were all on TV earlier in the year saying we'll have a result by the end of the year are all rapidly backtracking for the same reason. It's just nothing much we can do about that.
There was another question by the panelists to ask what evidence from the, we had a lot of questions in regards to documentation outside the trial that people have received their flu vaccine and their BCG vaccination. I don't know, how have you managed that in Melbourne? I mean, we've just provided them with certificates.
Yes, if people need that, so these are people who need to show that they had it within the trial so that they can prove to their employer. I don't know the simple answer to that, but if that's what people need, we'll obviously find a way to provide you with that to help you. The things like that, we're really looking for anything we can do to help you, because we're really grateful for all our participants. So simple things that we can do to return the favor, I'm all up for it.
In regards to the trial on the other sides, are there any particularly serious adverse, I mean, obviously not a serious adverse event because we would have heard about it, but are there any sort of like outstanding side effects that people have experienced?
We haven't really seen any side effects other than those expected at the injection site. And of course, that is the downside of the BCG vaccine, is that people will know that it, of course, gives you a scar. And in a small proportion of people, that can be quite an exaggerated or accelerated scar. But as we will have told you when you participated, fortunately, it's very unusual for that to cause any long-term problems, although we acknowledge in the short term, it can be certainly a nuisance. But generally, again, fortunately, it doesn't require any treatment. So it is a kind of a watch and wait type thing. But anybody who, I will emphasize again, that anyone who's worried, we obviously have our safety team, and you've got a very good safety team in West Australia, kind of led by Ushma. But if anybody's got any personal concerns, I'm always happy to talk to anyone about their individual issues if they're unusual things, as someone with more experience.
Yeah. Thank you. So I can just encourage the panelists. Now is really the time to keep asking. I've sort of like got a list of questions to go through that are questions that we've basically had coming up and up that are asked that we get repetitively. So how many times can you have the BCG vaccine? Let's say this works again, and now Australia is opening the borders. Can we all have the BCG again? What is the recommendation?
Yes, so that's another good question. And in our study so far, about half of the individuals in the study, participants, have actually had a BCG previously as part of the routine BCG program in Australia. So we used to, until kind of mid-80s, we gave BCG to, I think, adolescents. And so obviously, dare I say, the kind of slightly older people in our study will have had BCG before, or they might have had it because they were traveling or whatever. I've kind of lost my thread. About half our participants have had BCG before. And it's safe to have another BCG, we know that. And we think there's some evidence that actually, if you've had BCG before, it may provide a better training of your innate immune system. So there may be some advantage. So therefore, if you've now had your first, would it be good to have another one in the future? The answer is, of course, we don't know, but it is safe. So in the studies in the diabetics that I mentioned from Boston, they get numerous, I can't remember the number, but it's somewhere between 5 and 10 BCG vaccinations in that study. And I know For example, Frank Shan, who is a great proponent of the non-specific effects of BCG in Melbourne. I think he's had 8 or 9 shots himself. And so I think we don't know what the maximum number is. At the moment, there's no recommendation, of course, to have a shot unless you need it for BCG, of course, is the only known indication at the moment. But following this, maybe we'll have some evidence that a second, either a single or a second shot. I mean, one of the great things about our trial having half the people who've had one before is we'll be able to compare whether it's better in those who've had it before than those who haven't, of course.
Yeah. So the other question that came through is you did mention different strains, you know, Denmark and another strain in the beta style trial. What's the relevance of these strain differences of BCG?
So when BCG was created back, 100 years ago, after it was appreciated how effective it was in preventing particularly TB, particularly in younger infants and young children, it was sent all over the world, and each place it arrived at, it was renamed, but very unimaginatively. So it was called BCG Danish, BCG Japan, and all different things. Like in Brazil, it's BCG Moro, and we have BCG Russia, etc. And those strains were cultured in each country for decades. And whilst they were being cultured, they just mutated, and they're all different. And so there are now a dozen or so different strains that are manufactured in different plants worldwide from what were eventually stored seed lots that were from which those are derived. But we know that they are different genetically. They look differently when you grow them, because it's obviously a live vaccine, and they also induce a different immune response. But what's not known for certain is whether they have a different protective efficacy either against TB or the off-target effects. Although I can give you a whole other talk another day about why I believe there's fairly good indirect evidence that it makes a big difference. So why we're using the strain that we're using, which is BCG Danish. The reason we're using that is because it was the one that's registered in Australia and was available off the shelf on the day and is easy to get hold of, but we don't know whether it's the best one. So it was a pragmatic decision, and it's the one that's being used in all of the trials, not just our brace, but all those other ones for the same reason.
Mm-hmm.
But in the future, we're hoping to do studies of different strains, and that's something that we'd already been planning. But we don't know which is the best strain, but we know that BCG Denmark has had off-target effects in other trials. It is the one that was used in West Africa. So we're confident that if any BCG work, this strain should.
Okay. So at the moment, I can't see any other questions, but there's lots of positive feedback, and I'd love,
Yes.
You obviously wouldn't have had the time, but I think you definitely raised the bar, and people found this extremely useful. And now I've just got another question as well that I will ask you before I would thank everybody and close this meeting. Is a question saying, with the addition of an extra blood testing, is the reporting on the app of absence of symptoms still a requirement? Is the app still providing useful information if we now have more regular blood testing?
Yes, and that's from Lynette. And I see, yes, you're my favorite participant now, Lynette. I've seen your other comment, thank you. So Lynette, that's a great question. The answer is very much yes, because we, again, don't know. There's so many uncertainties with SARS-CoV-2, as I'm sure everybody's aware, being such a new virus, etc. We really don't know how long antibodies last, and we also will not just be, when we compare the groups for the non-COVID infections, we will be interested in even short-term coughs and colds and things if we show a difference between the two groups. So we will need that information from the app. But your real question was if you haven't had symptoms, we still need that as well, because although we can collect that at 3 months, in the surveys, you might say, well, actually, I've had nothing. I know that our data team spends so much time chasing people to collect those, and I know that irritates everybody when we do so. They do need to be able to show that, and we'll be asked by all the different regulatory bodies to show the proportion of people that provided those data points. So unfortunately, even for negative data, it's yes, but I hope, and please tell me if we can make it easier, that it should be a 20-second operation. When you get the reminder on the app, we're hoping it's just a question of saying, I've been fine, and that's just a quick tick off. And then you can, as Jarway said, give yourself another pat on the back. Before we end, can I just make one last comment? And that is, I do genuinely want to thank both yourself and the other PIs in Western Australia for helping us recruit so many participants so fast. but also the participants. And I want to acknowledge that we are totally aware of how much we're asking of you, and particularly how difficult that is when you haven't got COVID-19 staring you at the face. It kind of like, we definitely understand why it feels less important. I hope I've convinced you why it is, but thank you. We know it's quite a lot that we're asking of our participants to provide information every time you become ill with every minor thing is a big ask. Having 5 blood tests is a major ask, but hopefully as healthcare workers, not too scared by blood. But we're very grateful for all of that. And you are part of something that is international and will have a big impact, not just on COVID-19 and potential future pandemics, but understanding how BCG works. Perhaps the greatest life effect on mortality will be in understanding how BCG works in neonates, because in high mortality areas where BCG is preventing nearly half of neonatal deaths, understanding how it does this might mean that we can make something better or keep this going when we stop using BCG in areas that don't have TB. And so there's still so much more to learn about this vaccine, and BRACE is so much more than COVID-19. So thank you very much for your time today and for joining the BRACE trial.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I think that was absolutely fantastic. I learned a lot. It's recorded, so for all the ones that are that couldn't participate today, we will certainly make them aware of this. And I finally just like to thank my team, which is led obviously, as you will know, by Dr. Susan Herman here as our senior coordinator of the trial, and she's been absolutely instrumental in her team. So, but also I have to say that the Melbourne team have been absolutely fantastic in supporting us, and particularly Jiawei recently, and all the rest of your team, and yourself obviously talking to me directly as well. It's been a very good experience for us so far. We continue to work hard here, and I'm really excited and can't wait to see some outcomes. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you, everybody.